I just wanted to take a moment and build a little bit about 120 lessons. And what inspired me to put the video up is because I see a lot of people who I think don't really have the most appropriate perspective on why we as a 5% or the Nation of Gods on Earth actually have 120 lessons as 75% of our cultural curriculum. And that is without even considering our mathematics and our alphabets. The majority of what we learn about our principles and our values and the procedures we use to navigate life really exists within our lessons, not just mathematics or the alphabets. And in sharing that, I wanted to break 120 down in regards to 3 different dimensions in the way that we actually approach it. We often use the phrase, you have to knowledge 120, wisdom 120, and understand 120. And that's essentially talking about 3 different dimensions. 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, and 3 dimensions. And I'm going to break this video up into 3 different parts so that I can focus on each dimension and give you a little bit more insight so it's not as long altogether. Now the first dimension, or we say we knowledge 120, is talking about one-dimensional perspective. When you're talking about one-dimensional perspective, you're talking about length. And when you're talking about length, you're also implying a linear view, which means you're looking at things in the context of past, present, and future. So when people first engage studying the lessons, we strive to validate or verify whether or not these events that are spoken about in our lessons were historical. Did they actually happen? When we're looking at the measurements of the planet, whether it was Mount Everest being 29,141 feet high, or whether it was the Arctic Ocean being 390,000 square miles, we're examining how those calculations were actually made and what are they in comparison to the calculations that we have for those different dimensions of the planet, or even a different distance of the planets from the sun today. So that one-dimensional perspective is only dealing with length or width, whichever way you want to see it, but it lacks true depth. So it's important to engage the lessons from that perspective initially, because you have to verify how these calculations were made, as well as whether or not these events were historical. But when people stick to looking at things one-dimensionally, they lose sight of the true depth or the meaning of why we were even given the lessons to begin with. So on the negative side, people who only have a one-dimensional perspective of 120 tend to look at things in a linear fashion, and they say things like, well, that was the past. That's old school. That's obsolete. Those measurements or calculations aren't correct anymore. So they tend to diminish or minimize the importance of the actual lesson itself, because they're only looking at it in a linear fashion. So when you're looking at things linear, you're looking at it in this way. And if you look at it this way, you can see how it could flatline if you're only looking at things in regards to that was the past. It has nothing to do with the present, so I'm not even going to look at it as important in the future. So that's on the negative side. So then, you see people who are only looking at it one-dimensionally that tend to come across the lessons and deal with them in a very superficial way, because they lack true depth of what those lessons mean to them and what they actually mean as a whole. So that's the first perspective that people usually take and approach the lessons in. They look at it in a very linear fashion. They look at it in terms of past, present, and future, and it tends to be very superficial and it lacks true depth. Now the next video I'm going to put up is about looking at the lessons in a 2-dimensional perspective, or as we say, you wisdom 120. Peace.